Welcome to one more edition of Politics on Radar. Egberto Willis, your host. I am here with Sabeel Rahman. He's the president of Demos and Demos Action, a law professor at Brooklyn Law School, co-chair of the Law and Political Economy Project, and the author of several books, including the one that I love just by the name, Civic Power. Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis. Sabeel Rahman, how are you doing today, my friend?
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Look, it's great having you. I really love the organization for which you are the president of. Why don't you tell me a little bit about Demos first? Because I think Americans hear about all these different organizations that are out there, but they are not all the same. Tell us a little bit about Demos, very important organization.
Absolutely, super appreciate that. So Demos, we think of ourselves as a think and do tank focused on racial equity, democracy reform, and economic inequality. And for us, what that means is if you look all around us and see the crisis that this country is in, that crisis is not just about, who we vote for every 2 or 4 years. It's also about those deeper policies and frankly, ideologies that inform those policies that got us to this place, right? And so as a think tank, what we're doing is we're thinking about what are those policy ideas that we need to create a racially equitable, inclusive democracy? How do we then bring those ideas into reality by writing about them, working with folks who are policymakers, bringing litigation in key states, working with grassroots partners across the country to advocate for these ideas. So it's really many different tools, but the thrust of our work is about building an inclusive, equitable democracy and the role that ideas play in making that happen.
Now, how old is your organization?
So Demos is, we're just a little over 20 years old. We were founded in 2000, right after in the aftermath of the Bush v. Gore election. And now, 20 years later, the crisis of American democracy is even more apparent for everyone to see.
Now, look, after the election of President Obama, everybody thought we were a post-racial society. Everybody thought we were going to sing Kumbaya. We've overcome all the bad beginnings, if you will, of this country. I mean, we had that feeling, and it didn't last but probably 6 months or so, and then we got into this. Now, you wrote a book called Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis. I have always come to the conclusion that a lot of the problems that we have, first of all, it comes from above. In other words, if we are fighting among each other, we can't be looking at the root causes of our problems, which for all practical purposes has much to do with the economic system we have, with the type of hierarchy that we have. All those things can be combined in one. Civic knowledge, understanding civics is a necessity to mitigate this all. Why don't you tell me that in the context of your book? And folks, I want you all to get this book as well, because it'll teach you something about how we should operate as a society. Go ahead, my friend.
No, I appreciate that. And so, when my co-author, Holly Rusin-Gilman, and I set out to write the book, part of what we wanted to argue against we want to argue for what a democracy really requires. And the thing that we're trying to argue against is this sort of the thin notion that, well, actually, if you just elect the right person, or we show up to vote every couple of years, that's good enough, right? And of course, that's critically important, especially now. November is very soon.
Right.
We're really concerned about voter turnout this election, given the pandemic and the crisis. And so I do want to ensure that we talk about that. But elections, including this one in November, is really just step one in a much deeper project of making democracy work. And the problems of our democracy go much deeper, as you were saying. They're really structural. It's that we have a political system that is not designed to include and respond to the most affected frontline communities. You think about how many Black and brown communities, workers are actually in our elected positions of authority, right? What would the Fed look like, for example, if instead of Wall Street bankers and economists, it was actually governed by folks who had student debt, credit debt, who are workers in Black, brown, and immigrant communities, that you would make different policy if the institution was built that way. And so what we're trying to do in the book is to try to say, okay, we got to get out of this crisis we're in right now. Part of that is showing up to vote, but what happens after the election? Let's actually pursue the policies that build much more inclusive, responsive, accountable institutions, and that build the kind of grassroots organizations that we need to use those institutions effectively.
Now, you know, what is interesting, right, is a lot of folks don't quite understand that, you know, you talk policy and you talk economy, you talk the way things are currently. What a lot of people don't understand is all these things are human made. And as human made, they can be changed from an economic system to a political system. And when you get to the point where you think people before some standard or some status, that is how you move things forward. Now, how do we start? Because, I mean, we've been at this a long time, Sabeel, a very long time.
Yeah.
How do we start to build within people that they do have the power to do what we know have to get done? I mean, I really want you to put it in the context of civic power again, because that is what many of us really don't understand.
Yeah, I think it's such a great question, because I think we become habituated to this powerlessness, right? Things are happening to us. We look around and we think, well, how can we gain control over, you know, the pandemic, the economic collapse, these politicians who are, you know, not responding to what our communities need. And that powerlessness is itself a human creation, because it serves the interests of big corporations, of elected officials, to keep a monopoly on economic and political power. And so what we want to try to say in our work at Demos and in the book is that we can reclaim our power as communities, as members of the democracy. And it really takes a couple of things. Number one, it means working with collectives, collective action, thinking about the importance of grassroots organizing, community organizing, civil society groups, you know, everything from community groups to labor unions, right? These are ways that we can have more collective power than we can have as individuals. That's number one. Number two is just realizing what you were saying, that a lot of the things that we take as just this is the way the world is, that it doesn't have to be this way. Actually, we could cancel student debt, right? We could have an energy policy that responds to climate change. We could have a democratic system that actually, where every vote actually counts and is treated fairly, instead of having the kind of voter suppression that we have. We could make those changes if we want to. And then the third piece is we actually need to have different institutions. So Congress needs to run differently. Our local bodies at the city level and the state level can be more participatory, right? And so that change can happen even in our own communities as well as at the national level. So it's really, I mean, that's a lot to do, but I think for me, I find it empowering to realize that individually we might feel powerless, but collectively, when we join with one another and we actually make the bold demands, we can and have in the past changed this country.
Now, you use the word a lot, collectively, which is so important, but to work collectively also demands a certain democracy.
Yeah.
And to get to some of the points that we're going to talk about, one of the points is the right to the vote and to ensure that your vote counts. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the big things that we work on at Demos is defending the right to vote, especially for Black and Brown communities, right? You mentioned the historical roots of the challenges that we're in. You know, one of the hard realities about American democracy is that for much of it, from the founding, really, it has been built to be an exclusionary democracy, right? The vote was not for all of us, right?
Sabeel, that is such that is such an important realization. When America was founded, only 5% of the people qualified to vote. Absolutely. And we have this fallacy that this is this great democracy this people place where we always had one person, one vote. Expand on that, because I think when people learn the truth about that, it makes them more apt for change.
Yeah, it's well, and the story of that is actually a story about collective action and pressure making a different reality, right? So at the start of the country, the vote was really limited to white male property owners, and over time, it was because of the pressure from grassroots or social movements to expand the vote, expanding the vote to outside of the property owning class. Then we passed a constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, to enfranchise women. We had to fight a civil war and pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to create the kind of constitutional equality for Black Americans, right? And part of that was the right to vote. And I often tell people the story that, the high watermark of Black political power, electoral political power, for a long time was in those first few years after the Civil War. You
Right.
saw really high during Reconstruction, exactly, because you had this constitutional change and you had, and it was being enforced on the ground and in the courts. And it's only because of a backlash by, that's when you see the KKK and the rise of paramilitary white nationalist forces with allies in the states and in the Congress, who literally fought a counter-revolution to suppress the Black vote.
Sabeel, it's important what you've just noticed there with the backlash as well, because in 2009, we went through the same kind of a thing as well with a backlash. But I think more importantly, what you're alluding to is that democracy isn't a static thing. It's something that has to be continuously nurtured, because if you think you're going to, we're post this and post that, now we can sit down and go have a cup of coffee and just let it be. It's something that always needs to be worked on. You want to expand on that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I so agree with your critique of the post-racial kind of discourse of after 2008, right? Because what we've seen is exactly proves your point that look, it will always be profitable for some people to break democracy, right? Because it's much easier to hoard wealth, profits, political control if you don't have a functioning democracy. And so if we believe in democracy, part of that has to be the continual fight to defend and advance democratic ideas. It doesn't just happen. And so, when we look at what's happening even right now with the 2020 election coming upon us, this is a street fight for our democracy all the way down. We're seeing, local officials trying to even weaponize the pandemic to try to drive down voter turnout, right? Closing polling places in majority Black and brown neighborhoods as a way to reduce turnout for people who might, vote a different way from the people in power. And, first of all, that's morally evil. But second of all, it just shows the point that the vote is powerful. If it weren't powerful, they wouldn't try so hard to keep it from us. And it has to be, and that power has to be fought for and defended so that we actually can use it.
I want to go on a little tangent. Now that we're talking the vote and the power of vote and the power of democracy, I just want to get your thoughts on this, because it's something that's been bothering me all along. Yeah. I've been saying that the country has been moving into a wanting of more democracy, but what we've seen with a Senate that has confirmed a lot of anti-democratic type justices, that we are setting the country up to be run by a minority.
Yes.
And with the help of a judiciary. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We sort of have under the guise of a democracy, what we actually have is minority rule and a setup for minority rule for a long time to come. So if you think about the Supreme Court, for example, but also the lower courts after this administration, one of the consistent patterns of Trump and also George W. Bush appointees is a hostility to voting rights, right? It was during the Obama years that the Roberts Court ruled on Citizens United, opening the floodgates of big money, ruled on this important case, Shelby County, which actually gutted the Voting Rights Act. That was the product of the civil rights movement, right? One of the
yeah.
civil rights movement victories. And it's it's because of those decisions that actually it's much easier for, Governor Kemp in Georgia, for example, to purge
Voter rolls.
300,000 Black and brown voters from the rolls in an election that he won in 2018 by 55,000, right? And so we have rampant voter suppression, in part enabled by the courts. We also now have a Senate, which, the Senate was always designed, to your earlier point, that we weren't founded as a democracy. The Senate was always designed as a sort of elite, aristocratic check on popular accountability. But that problem is getting worse and worse. When you think about now with the filibuster and with the fact that every state gets 2 senators, the reality is that a very small fraction of the country's population has a veto on all legislative decision-making. So that is not democracy, right? It's one of the big reasons why, even in this pandemic, we don't have a response for people who are struggling to pay the bills or to keep a roof over their heads. The House has passed multiple recovery bills and emergency relief bills. It's the Senate that's sitting on those bills, right? And there's wildfires now happening in California. If we didn't have an electoral college where that separates us into safe states and swing states, do we really think that if the president thought that he had to win California's votes, that he would let California burn? No,
He
right?
hasn't even mentioned it.
He hasn't even mentioned it because he knows that he can't win California, and he knows that he doesn't have to win California
Or
in order to stay in office.
Oregon.
Or Oregon or Washington. And
right.
like we have a system that actually incentivizes elected officials like the president to actively ignore and harm huge swaths of the country, geographically and demographically, right? And so now I've gone on a tangent a little bit here, but your point is well taken that, when you add all of this up, we have minority rule, and we have a president and a party in power that has optimized a strategy for minority rule, right? He's not running to be president of the whole country. He's running to be president of the 35% of extreme far right, white nationalist, white supremacist voters who are sticking with him through thick or thin, even when that means condemning so many people to a terrible pandemic and economic collapse.
VBM, so how do we protect?
VBM, vote by mail. Yeah, so a lot is going to depend in November on vote by mail. So one of the things we've been working on at Demos is a bunch of policy ideas and advocacy campaigns in the states and litigation to try to protect vote by mail. There are a couple of things that I would highlight for folks. Number one, it's going to be really, really important to make sure that we loosen some of the restrictions on how vote by mail operates, right? So, a lot of states have, for example, signature verification policies and postmark deadlines that are actually really punitive and mean that a lot of ballots may not get counted properly. So we need to open up those restrictions, and that's really an issue for state legislatures. So, whatever state you are that you're listening in, it'd be really important for state secretaries of state and state legislatures to open up their vote by mail policies. That's number one. Number two is we need to make sure that everyone actually gets a mail-in ballot. Even now, you have a lot of states that are fighting over this idea of, should we send ballots to people? When should we send them? Maybe we'll only send it to some people, right? In the middle of a pandemic, everybody should get access to a mail-in ballot if they want.
Now, Sabeel, we only have 7 weeks left.
Absolutely. So at this point now, it's going to become really critical for people to do their part, not depending on the government, but make sure you're registered, make sure you've got your ballot. There's lots of resources online to sort of help kind of confirm, and depending on your locality, what the policies are and what the deadlines are. But I would encourage people to not wait for election day. The election is basically happening now, right? Ballots are starting to be mailed. Make sure you're registered, make sure you're getting your ballot, make sure you submit your ballot early so that it actually gets there in time and gets counted. And then the last thing I would say too is people should be prepared for not election day, but election month. Right? We will not know the results on November 4th. It's very unlikely that we will have a full tabulation by the day after the election. It's going to be very important that we let all the ballots be counted before calling the election.
Let me tell you, Sabeel, what I'm really hoping for is that, and I I just have this gut feeling that the country is going to have a switch, that sooner than later, and they're going to say, do I really want to put up with this? And that things are not going to be as tight as we think they are going to be. I mean, it's a hope. I mean, if all the
Yeah.
work that you do is successful in getting people to participate and get busy with their civic duty, I think a switch, that's just a personal opinion, I think a switch is going to occur. Now, tell me a little bit about how COVID-19 has really exposed what we must call racial capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, the COVID crisis is, I mean, I really hope you're right about November. You know, I'm an optimist at heart too, so I do think that we're going to see a change of course. But the COVID crisis is a good reason for why that's so desperately needed, right?
Right.
What we're seeing with COVID is it's actually preying upon all the already existing inequities of our economy. So we think about, you know, who are the essential workers who are keeping everyone housed and fed and alive, but also putting their lives at risk just to keep food on the table. These are predominantly Black and brown workers, women workers, right, who are staffing the, who are kind of like staffing in our agriculture systems, in our retail environments. And these workers were always vulnerable and precarious, right, with low pay, not poor access to healthcare, not an inadequate safety net. And so what COVID has done is made that insecurity even more dangerous, even worse, because of the collapse and the pandemic. So when we say that COVID is a sign of the deeper structural problems of our economy, those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. That if we invest in an equitable and inclusive economy that works for everybody, then we would actually be better able to weather these types of crises, right? Because if people didn't have to worry about access to healthcare, about making their debt payments, about having affordable housing, for just to name three examples, right? We could survive a momentary crisis. But what's happening with this crisis is that it's now we're in a situation now where we have 40 million plus Americans who are at risk of being evicted and homeless because now we're in the third month where they can't make their rent payments. And these are predominantly working class Black and brown Americans. That's because they were already housing insecure because of our housing affordability crisis.
Now, Sabeel, first of all, your work is so important, and making those statements are so important because there are two ways to spin what's going on right now, right? The other way that many on the right are attempting to spin that more people of color are the ones dying from this disease, they would want to spin it as irresponsible behaviors, as opposed to it being a systemic problem. Your narrative is so important to get out there so that doesn't cauterize into the minds of many, because already, they're this way because they're lazy. They're this way because they eat unhealthy. They're this way, when that is really something across the board. And so I think it is so important that you've actually created the appropriate and correct narrative that this is racial capitalism that is creating this particular problem in the deaths that we're seeing.
Totally. And that personal responsibility narrative is part of that racist system that tries to blame individuals for what is actually the result of the policies that have been put in place, by Democrats and Republicans, to be honest, right? Like there was a study in the New York Times this weekend conclusively showing how the COVID death rates and vulnerability rates are higher in areas with greater air pollution, that have a history of greater air pollution. Now, those are the same neighborhoods where these are predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods where, because of the way our cities have been zoned and built for the last 30 years, we put the coal plant where, in a neighborhood.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard, exactly. And, as a result, for a long time, people of color have higher asthma rates, higher incidences of heart disease, higher exposure to air pollution. And now we're seeing that that's also causing higher risk to COVID, right? It's that 30 years worth of policies that we're paying the price for now.
That is so important. It's good that you put that out there. Okay, we're coming close to the end, so I want to talk about something important that you call our moment of a third moment of radical progressive American Reconstruction. Talk to me.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about how this country was not founded to really be an inclusive democracy. And when I think about our history, I also think about those moments where we have actually fought to expand the meaning of democracy in a powerful and inspiring way. And so the first of those moments was Reconstruction after the Civil War, where we finally removed slavery from the Constitution, created what was then the high watermark of Black political power and inclusion, right, in the 1860s. The backlash to that stopped the first Reconstruction, from achieving its full potential. The second Reconstruction, I think of as the Civil Rights Movement, right? In the 60s, we created the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. John Lewis marched, and we have these heroes of the Civil Rights Movement who really, once again, tried to expand the meaning of American democracy to include Black and brown people as full members with equal dignity. I think the fight we're in now, the reason this moment feels so fraught is because we're actually in the middle of a third Reconstruction, where the real issue is just like in those other two previous moments, it's really about who is this democracy for? Is this going to be a multiracial, inclusive democracy where Black, brown, indigenous, people of color are full, fair, and equal members of the democracy? Or is this going to be a backlash against that idea, trying to hoard the fruits of the country for whiter and wealthier communities? That's the fork in the road. And the president is explicit about which side he's on. But the reason I'm optimistic is I think we're sort of confronting these deeper systems so openly. We're seeing them so openly now in this COVID moment, in this Trump moment, that if we can win in November and actually make the systemic changes that we're talking about in our conversation, I think we're actually can inaugurate a whole different phase of democracy that we've never had before, that is much more inclusive, much more responsive, and actually meets the needs of our communities. And to me, that's exciting. There is an upside on the other side of all of this that I think if we win, we can really achieve something important.
Sabeel, and I don't even think that is pie in the sky. I actually believe that. That's why I do what I do. That's why you do what you do. Sabeel, is there something that you would have liked me to ask you that I hadn't asked you?
No, this is a great conversation, and so grateful for the space that you've curated here. I know this show is such an important part of the conversation. One thing I'd love for folks to also just keep in mind, right, is that we need everybody to show up in November, but also to show up beyond November, right? Join the groups in your community, add the pressure to your voice to your pressuring your local electeds at the state, city, and federal levels, right? This project of building a democracy that we just talked about is going to take the next 5, 10, 15 years. It's doable, but it will require all of us. And so I just hope that everyone who is nervous and anxious and worried in this moment, that we can channel that productively to vote in November, but then to stay engaged and continue the fight beyond it.
Sabeel Rahman, president of Demos and author of Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
I'm Egberto Willies, host of Politics Done Right, an independent news program. I post several news videos of interest every day. I ask you so kindly to subscribe to my channel, and please leave me some comments. Thank you very much.